Welcome to the Dr. Joe Show. We got a special guest for you. Please keep in mind, none of this is medical advice. Any medical questions about any medical problems or any content of this show, you should direct straight to your primary doctor. Please enjoy. We have a very special guest here with us today, and he runs the Merogenomics website. His name is Dr. Raszek, and I have been following his content for some time now, particularly with his keen ability to interpret scientific research papers and break them down for the lay public. So this is going to be a discussion specifically on a recent drug that was released for the pandemic, and we're going to be going into some other topics as well. So, Dr. Raszek, can you please introduce yourself and where you're actually signing in from here today?
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Raszek. So pretend the J is an I. That's how you
Okay.
pronounce my name. I get Mikolaj all the time, but
Thank you.
I would introduce myself as Mikolaj Raszek, Dr. Mikolaj Raszek. And I am connecting from Edmonton, Alberta. That's Western Canada. Edmonton is the capital of the province of Alberta. And that's also where I have my consultation business based as well. And what Merogenomics is about is to help people gain private access to medical DNA testing. So that's really the purpose of Merogenomics. Medical DNA testing is obviously entrenching itself more and more within the medical community, but it's still fairly novel technology and not yet wildly used where at a position where, say, if you go to a doctor's office, boom, you're talking about DNA testing. That's not the case yet, obviously, but I do believe it will be one day as the technology is very wildly used, which I'm absolutely certain it will be. So that's my dream. That's what I love to do. Along the way, of course, pandemic happened, and that definitely deflected people's lives choices and goals to some degree. And that's when I started my YouTube channel under the same name. I started a YouTube channel first educating about DNA testing, but there's a very little viewership of that content to this day. However, the content in relation to COVID-19 and the vaccines, people were much more interested in that. I still have the capacity, of course, to read science papers. Molecular biology is my background. So I have a degree in genetics and a degree in biochemistry. These are interrelated topics. Molecular biology on an atomic scale, that's where I get my kicks. That this is the stuff I really like. And sometimes I get to bring these complicated or seemingly complicated scientific topics, and I try to my best ability to break it down into more regular language, sometimes with greater success than other times. And the channel became very popular. So that's probably like the overall summary as to where I am and what I do.
Great. I think that's wonderful. So there's I guess two papers that I wanted to bring up. There's a prominent doctor on YouTube who highlighted this phase 2 clinical trial. Did you have a chance to see it, and did the link work that I sent?
Yeah, I looked at the clinical trial myself, but there weren't any results of the trial yet.
Yeah, so I mean,
It's
I think this
strictly
is
simply describing what the trial is about.
exactly, yeah. So and I remember you had mentioned, so folks, Dr. Raszek mentioned something to me. As soon as he heard the mechanism of Paxlovid, he dismissed it. But so let's just go over real quick. I'm going to summarize this clinical trial. It's a phase 2 randomized double blind, and it's a treatment for long COVID. So now, folks, let's back up. There is no agreed uh, constellation of symptoms that represents long COVID. What long COVID is highly debated, first of all, okay? And this is a study supposedly treating long COVID. So we're just laying that out. Then in their treatment group, it's nirmatrelvir, and ritonavir, and then the placebo group is actually ritonavir. So your placebo is not actually a placebo, even though they're calling it a placebo. And
Mm,
then
I,
and this trial should be done like sometime next year or like late this year.
I actually think that's the correct placebo in this case because what they're doing is they're Paxlovid is a combination drug combo, right?
Mhm.
So in order for them to really eke out the differences between one versus the other, and only one of them is supposed to be the actual drug working towards the COVID, the other component that is also included in placebo, that's the one that acts as an inhibitor of one of your metabolic enzymes that is used that otherwise would break down too fast the drug that you want to use against COVID. So that's why they need to put it in a placebo because you need to start comparing what is the drug we want to use against COVID development, COVID symptoms versus the drug that simply is an inhibitor of one of your metabolic enzymes. So what I'm saying is that in my opinion, that was actually the right placebo. Maybe they could have included a third group, which would have been no drug at all. But I think you still would have to have one where you only have the inhibitor and not the anti-COVID drug, if I can say it. I don't know how to pronounce the name, so I'm not even gonna try.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I struggled with that first one, right? So that's a great point. Now I'm gonna bring in a little discussion of another trial that was published in February in the Clinical Infectious Disease Journal on February 8th of 2023. Characterization of virologic rebound following that combo drug treatment for COVID-19. And basically, the short of it is they found that several of the patients had culturable virus over 2 weeks after treatment, and there were no mutations associated with that. So, and I can just give you my clinical impression as well as the clinical impression of several colleagues of mine with the use of this medication. I know of a doctor here in town who was totally pro Paxlovid until they took it themselves, and they got horrific rebound and they were miserable for like another week after they took it. And then clinically, between me and several colleagues, we've all noticed that it's like a coin toss whether this medication even appears to work. And I've had many patients complain to me about it. So, what are your thoughts on just that? Because we have the research side and we have everybody pushing this, and then we have the clinical side, and I feel like the clinical side doesn't get talked about much.
So of course, I presume that was directed at me, the question, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. It's my number one issue with the drug was its complexity. And so the mechanism as to why we have this rebound, I don't know. I don't know what that mechanism is as to why do we see this rebound. So the paper you just mentioned just simply was probably one of those few papers. I would imagine it's many now, many more, because this issue came to the forefront soon after Paxlovid started to be used en masse, and this became really obvious that there is this rebound effect. And that's what this paper you mentioned highlights, that within certain time window, and I think it was within, say, 2 weeks, these patients who once they started taking Paxlovid, they no longer had these clinical symptoms, but then they had a rebound with associated increase of the pathogen genetic material. Of course, we're talking about the pathogen is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, so it's easy to track. You just have to look at the presence of genetic material. That's the famous PCR test that we all had to take at some point. And even in some of these individuals, they even were able to culture the virus from the sample, which is like the probably the best way to prove infection truly happened, but it's challenging. It's very challenging, and it doesn't always work. Hence, only maybe half of these people showed the cultural state. But what's the mechanism behind that? I didn't really see that in that paper. I tried to find it. I don't really know. My primary issue with Paxlovid was simply its complexity. and i.e. you're using the drug combo. And the reason why um, I was why would we be thinking of Paxlovid? Because of that complexity, I would be thinking, don't we have something that is simpler? Because when you need an inhibitor for a very important metabolic enzyme, this metabolic enzyme that you need to inhibit is automatically used in many other medications that doctors have to prescribe to the patients. And then what are you going to do? How are you going to assess that? That just makes it so much more challenging, in my opinion. I'm not a medical doctor, but in my opinion, that would make it so much more challenging for the treating physician to suddenly, hey, I need to monitor all the list of drugs that could be affected by this particular inhibitor, because those drugs could be affected by the metabolic enzyme. Then I need to check, is the patient on any of these drugs? And if they are, now I have to specifically monitor that drug to see if the function of the other drug is now affected because I put Paxlovid in. One of the areas that I think maybe doctors could consider mitigating, and this is of course my forte, my area of interest, my bias, even, if you will, right? We're all biased individuals. That's considering taking the pharmacogenetic test, um, to determine where perhaps the individual lies in terms of how that metabolic enzyme genetically is already affected in a given individual. Because we all have mutations, you can take the pharmacogenetic DNA test and determine how are these mutations affecting behavior of these enzymes. To me, all doctors should be doing this for the patients if they're pushing any medications. The only problem is that not many medications are still clinically validated to person's genetics. That's still on an ongoing, of course, progress. But that's the reason why. And another reason is because, to me, Paxlovid acts in the same mode as what is suspected. This has not been confirmed because money doesn't go in this direction, but
Mm-hmm.
how it's suspected that vitamin D works as well. So I
Oh,
would be considering, why don't we use vitamin D prophylactically? We all know vitamin D is very valuable for your immune system. We all know how vitamin D is actually very powerful for properly, mm, how should I say, boosting your or enhancing the quality of your immunological responses. I would be focusing more on that as opposed to something that complicated. And if we're promoting Paxlovid use, fantastic, yes, but then I would be collecting a lot of information right now on the patients, including how are these other drugs might be affected. Because the sooner doctors can know that information, the more accurate this Paxlovid could be used. And sometimes it means we cannot use it for you because you're on this medication, and they will start interfering with one another. That's where I think would be ideal.
so there should be possibly a lot of hard stops instead of, doctors just getting a call, oh, hey, I tested positive, can you call it in for me? And then the doctor just writes it without even looking at their med list. Because I think that might be happening a lot. So that's one thing.
Hmm.
I'm so glad you brought up the vitamin D. In my limited clinical experience during the Delta wave of the pandemic, I was working off and on in the COVID unit here in the town that I live for about 6 months off and on, because I was working part time for different reasons due to family obligations. But um, I was eating vitamin D like candy. By the way, I checked my vitamin D level in March of 2021. I want to say I got my level up to 85, popping them in my mouth just without even really thinking about it. And I kind of stopped at that point. But clinically, what I ended up started doing after I reviewed, I, there's a website. I'll send it to you. COVID Meta or C19 Meta. I'll send it to you. So I decided, hey, we have ergocalciferol, vitamin D2, the 50,000 unit blue capsules. So I started automatically giving my COVID patients 5 days in a row of once daily 50,000 D2. And I was checking their vitamin D levels in the beginning and afterward. And I can tell you that the people who had vitamin D levels less than 20 of the standard units, I think it's nanograms per deciliter or something like that, they had more severe symptoms, worse oxygen requirements, and in a couple cases, in patients, even obese patients who refused remdesivir, right? Because the hospital was automatically just giving it to people when they came in. Like it wasn't even really the hospitalist that ordered it, it was just being given. In several of those obese patients who you predicted, like, hey, you're high risk, a lot of them got discharged, the ones I gave vitamin D to. But the problem is, um, I wasn't able to compile that data since I'm not at that hospital anymore. But um, many of my patients that I gave high dose vitamin D to, they reported to me that they feel better more so than other people that didn't get it. That's just a really cool observation I made. And then there's the website, the FLCCC. Are you guys now, Dr. Raszek? Are you familiar with that website?
No, not the acronym at all.
So FLCCC, if you go to Google and you type it in, and I'm always reminding my patients and all my friends about this, it's totally free. It's all material uh, on treating COVID, and it's all backed up with quite a bit of data, and most of the components are over the counter. So it involves adequate vitamin D levels, and they even have a dosing scheme of how to get vitamin D into your body adequately and in a reasonable fashion. Vitamin C, and I even changed that. I say liposomal because liposomal overclocks your intestinal absorption of your vitamin C. And then zinc and all the other stuff that, of course, you can read about there. But yeah, I think vitamin D was tremendously underappreciated, and right up until the time I left my hospital, almost all my colleagues thought it was a crazy idea, and then a few of them picked up on it, which I thought was good.
That's the. By the way, I'm familiar with the website. Actually, I've seen some of their. I believe they have interviews with different guests.
Dr. Corey,
But
yeah,
yeah, vitamin D in general is underappreciated big time. It's one of those things that I would recommend for anyone to start considering taking vitamin D precisely because of how it can promote healthier immune system. And in my way of thinking, in my molecular world thinking, your health is primarily linked to the quality of your immune system. So of course, unless you have something mechanistically broken in you, right? And but otherwise, if you are presumed healthy individual, and as you age and you attain different conditions, that is primarily linked in my head to the quality of your immune system. And of course, we degrade our immune system with our lifestyle, with basically how we live. So doctors don't say this because it's automatically assumed, but that would be probably the number one message of any doctors, I would imagine, is lead a healthy lifestyle. It's a number one thing. If you do that, I don't have to see you as often. And it's not like doctors need to worry about that. There will always be sick people, right? But ideally you'd want to see illnesses as late in someone's life as possible, right? And I think how frequently or how early that might happen in large measure will depend on the quality of the immune system. And vitamin D is a very simple simple way of improving the quality of your immune system. And don't know, haven't studied it to that great degree as to what might be potential dangers of having too much vitamin D. But
oh,
it's supposed to be fairly safe product that you can take it even large quantity. Um, it just, and also apparently it takes a long time if you're just taking vitamin D. You mentioned one of the metabolites of vitamin D. That's the pathway down the road from the vitamin D we swallow. Eventually, it has to be to change, altered, and that's
it
the
did.
metabolites. Those metabolites are even more powerful. So when you mentioned it, I was like, oh, right on, because that actually would have had even more rapid influence in helping your patients, because you are already giving them access to a form of vitamin D that was already down the chain of where it was supposed to be before you start getting those quality protective effects of vitamin D. So,
So,
so I was happy to hear that. Right on. Absolutely. I would think standard, always consider taking vitamin D, and maybe do measure yourself, your levels. It is very well understood that vitamin D deficiency does increase your risk of different illnesses. And that's not just vitamin D, vitamins deficiencies in general. Ideally, you would want to negate that, mitigate that as much as you can. And it's easy to achieve. You just simply have to take supplements.
so we're not here giving medical advice, but I'm curious for an adult, you an adult, what is a safe dosage, daily dosage of vitamin D?
That is debatable.
I
I
don't know either.
What I do personally for my patients, most people can probably get away with taking 2,000 units a day and never get checked. Okay, there's always going to be an outlier, somebody with renal failure, somebody with their baseline creatinines over two something, and they could overdose eventually, right? But if you're supplementing D, first of all, I always assume everybody's low in vitamin D, for flat out. Even people who are tanned, working out outside all the time, like like they're darker than me, uh, and they're supposed to be more fair skinned than me. Like I check everybody because I don't care, because almost everybody's low. Once
Mhm.
they're low, I start low and I go slow. And then if they're in renal failure, if they have any type of renal compromise, I I go even more slow. So, instead of taking a standard dose every day, I'll say, hey, just take a few doses on the weekend, and let's check it again and on your next lab check. So when you're careful, you're not really going to overdose people, and you'll get them up. Like I like to get people at least between 40 and 60. If you talk to naturopaths, they want people close to 100. I think virtually all labs, all of the allopathic labs, they agree if you get your levels up to 150, you're going to get problems, like you're going to get kidney stones, and you don't want that. So um, and now there's more research and there's more awareness about vitamin K2 with vitamin D, because vitamin D influences calcium metabolism. And what vitamin K2 does is it prevents excessive calcification of your arteries over time. So so make sure your vitamin D has a little bit of K2 with it. Okay. Now, this excludes patients who are on blood thinners, who have blood clotting disorders, because if you start messing around with their vitamin K and they're already on warfarin, then the Coumadin clinic's not going to be happy, right? So this, this can be reasonably experimentally applied to somebody who doesn't have a lot of medical problems, who wants to try and be healthier, I would say.
So everybody who's listening to this, please hear primary care physician for your health advice.
Yeah. I mean, I really hope you all have primary care doctors that can help you. Unfortunately, a lot of doctors don't have time to talk about nutrition, and unfortunately, a lot of the nutritional advice is indirectly funded by food industries that create unhealthy food. So then, where do you get your advice from for nutrition, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like this leads partially into some of these articles that I found on your website, Dr. Raszek. Fluoride interferes with iodine absorption. I skimmed through the article. Fascinating. So you think it might be influencing autism?
So I looked at some of the scientific publications where different authors proposed that theory, and I wanted to amplify that. And the reason no one knows it's a theory, the
Of
reason why I
course.
want to amplify that is because of the fact that no one else understands why we have the incessant rise in autism. We all agree by now that it's real, it's true, it's very measurable, and it's nonstop. The rise is continuously increasing. So the rate of incidence is continuously increasing. And some people propose the concept that it might have to do with fluorine in the water. And the reason why is because fluoride, the ion, interferes with proper absorption of iodine. And iodine is ultimately what you need in order for producing a specific hormones, I believe it was by your thyroid, in order for the brain to properly develop in during pregnancy and immediately post-birth. And perhaps this lack of ability to produce these hormones at the right time, at the right level, because of inhibition of iodine uptake by the body of the developing fetus, that might feed into some of these developmental issues that basically are hallmark of autism. And the reason why I want to bring that is because, well, hey, it's a theory. Science is all about theories. And then, of course, the goal of science is to start building enough evidence, meaning repetition, that a theory becomes something like a fact. But everything is really just theories. Even when we call it a fact, it's still a theory that is really backed up by a lot of evidence, right? And we need to be able to discuss everything, including running the risk of discussing nonsense, as long as you back up your theories with scientific references, and not like science never gets anything wrong. It's actually very common for science to get incorrect information. Hence, we need to start stacking evidence when we build theories. This is one that I think maybe we should look at it, because nothing should be off the table right now for us to understand why is this happening. And this is a very simple suggestion, simple theory. I can appreciate why maybe we might be very much against that concept, because this idea of putting fluoride in our water is considered something like a great medical achievement of 20th century, because it reduced tooth decay. My understanding, that's the only benefit we have from that. But we do need to explore if there's a possible negative outcomes as well. We need to be open-minded to explore that. And that was the purpose of that article. But I prefaced it, hey, I just read a bunch of science papers, consider this. This is not a mainstream accepted topic at all, like none, not even considered.
Well, I liked it because it made me think of hypothyroidism, because the way I was taught hypothyroidism, when you screen people for their TSH, their T4, their T3. Now, just to give folks a background, this is just very, very, very baseline. You know, we at least check a TSH. My lab at my clinic, we check T4 and T3 as well. But your TSH comes out of your brain, comes out of your pineal gland. No, sorry, your pituitary gland. And then that stimulates the T4 to be released out of your thyroid. And then T4 is not as active as the T3 metabolite. And you have enzymes all over your body that will just activate the T4 to T3. And then some of your T3 is bound up and some of it's free. And so we look at all that, and different abnormalities point to different things, like biotin supplementation can just botch those results and make it look weird, even though it's normal. But if the foundation of your thyroid function, which is having adequate iodine stores from before you're born, I mean, if fluoride is interfering with that, even if there's a question that it's interfering with that, because that original fluoride study, I think there's only one study, Dr. Raszek. There was that one case in that town where they gave all those kids fluoride and voila, their teeth were better. I'm not sure that research has been repeated very much. So then it leads to the question, are pregnant females getting dental procedures? Are they going for teeth cleaning? And is this fluoride exposure in their mouth also increasing their baby's risk? And when we see hypothyroidism, which is high TSH, low thyroid numbers, what do? We just treat it and we stop thinking about it. So so then it's like, well, we're not worried about why, we're just going to treat it. And this is what happens in a lot of primary care settings, because patients will often have 10 other things that you're addressing. And so you're not going to dive down a rabbit hole unless you're a specialist like in endocrinology.
Yeah, I mean, and to be honest, eh, that's not medical doctors' role. If they're willing to do this on their own time,
Hmm.
great. But honestly, medical doctors are just too busy. I
Yeah,
mean, like you mentioned, each patient has 10 things potentially they could discuss, and you have
right.
a lot of time, and it's look, I would never want to be medical doctor. I think it's such a challenging job, and such a demanding job. On top of that, you have to have the capacity to deal with a lot of human suffering as well, and we, the regular public, completely ignore that and completely ignore the influence of medical doctors contending with constantly dealing with human suffering and human pain. That's not without its own impact as well, right? So we need researchers who help medical doctors. Ultimately, medical doctors, they should get like a sound bite from researchers saying, hey, thanks through all the records you've been collecting, we were able to now analyze those records of all these patients. We see a correlation, and now we're suspecting maybe, and let's just now make up the correlation. Maybe fluoride is now linked to rise in autism, and data starts to suggest that, right? Like doctors don't, we should not be expecting medical doctors from doing this. But we need to collect data so that others who have the capacity, whose job it is to analyze the data, make these connections, can bring it forward, and then medicine can adjust accordingly, which is how medicine works. Sometimes these adjustments are faster, sometimes they're slower, and that's just how it is. Look, we will never ever run out of topics to complain about how medicine could be improved. Never, whether it's right now or whether we're gonna look century from now or 1,000 years from now, there will always be desire to improve medicine, and there will always be mistakes in how medicine is applied, right? That's just part of natural order of things, if you will, right? So
Let's
just
let's
something that
let's
we should maybe look, that there may be a correlation, just because it's such an enigma. Why is this happening? It's just total enigma. No one can understand why. We know it's genetics play a role. We know environment plays a role, like lifestyle. But why? What exactly? What's going on? That's not. We don't have that solved at all.
So I'm just a quick lay question here. I'm just curious because, as they say, proof's in the pudding. Do you two use toothpaste with fluoride?
No.
No. What do you use?
I do. I don't pay attention, but then look, what difference does it make? I live in a region where water fluoride is in the water, and I cannot. I mean, unless I use filter, and I actually, after I read this, I'm like, should I get a filter, right? Because there is evidence that fluoride can start influencing your pituitary gland, right?
Yep.
So there is evidence from both, like in that article when I was checking the research. I think it's the evidence comes from both humans based on cadavers and animal studies as well, right? So at this point, yeah, I don't bother because, but if I was pregnant woman, which I'm not, by the way, in case in case like
Anybody's
it's not
questioning?
obvious, then I would consider maybe that as an option, and maybe I wouldn't necessarily think of fluoride. Oh, I need to avoid fluoride, but maybe I would consider, how do I make sure my iodine levels are appropriate to make sure the developing baby um, has access to these thyroid hormones, which we need for brain development, right? So I would definitely be thinking along those lines. So not necessarily I have to be like fluoride is evil. You can still just ignore that topic. There might be a link, but the take-home message of that was, if you're pregnant woman, you want to make sure that you have enough iodine for those hormones to be properly built and that the baby can properly develop. And soon post-birth, then and at that point is, of course, all in the newborn's hands, biology.
I like that you use the word natural, because what we consider natural now, I think, is in question, because people could look at humanity and call everything that comes from humanity natural, right? Because we're all animals on this planet. That's one way of looking at it, right? And even petroleum is natural, right? Because it came out of the ground. So benzene's natural. But there are lots of things that are not natural. And this goes back to what you were saying, how doctors deal with a lot of human suffering. We go through a lot of training to deal with a lot of human suffering and to consolidate knowledge to take care of people. The doctor's three jobs. There's three pillars of being a physician, being a doctor. One is diagnosis, okay? Establishing what is going on. And then the second one is what is the management strategy? And the management can be just a treatment, a cure, a surgery, whatever, but it's management. But the last pillar is palliation. It's managing suffering. And palliative care is now a fellowship that doctors can become certified in, because people don't want to do it anymore. And that's in part due to the narcotics that came over here after Vietnam, and just how we've had a narcotic epidemic. And narcotics it's just a pendulum. We swing in one direction, you're not treating pain enough. Now we're in the other direction where everything's locked down and you have to be an addiction specialist or a pain doctor to give high dose narcotics to people, because frankly we abuse the power. But the burden of metabolic disease in clinic that I see, and that everybody else I talk to agrees that they see: diabetes, hypertension, obesity, metabolic syndrome, syndrome X, that accounts for 80 to 85% of our burden. So we go through medical school, we learn about all these exotic things, all these unique skin findings, all these physical exam maneuvers, that heart murmur, this pulmonary we learn all these things only to get into healthcare management, and 4 out of 5 of our patients, they all have the same thing, because they're eating garbage that the USDA calls food, and they're getting sick from it. And you talk about inflammation a lot. We're connected with a GI doctor, Dr. Hazen, and she's all about the microbiome, and that's a whole other topic that we could talk about. So you've heard of Dr. Hazen?
I smell names oftentimes, because I encounter too many names.
I know.
Microbiome though,
yeah.
When you mentioning she's all over that, I'm like, yeah, right on.
Yeah, so she did, and actually, I don't think I'm going to talk about her findings, because that TikTok video got taken down. So I'm not going to say that here. Maybe I'll send it to you. But microbiome is very sensitive to a lot of things, and particularly COVID-19. There was an article about COVID-19 posted by somebody, I think from Africa. Really good articles that come out of some African countries that are really poignant. But this one said COVID-19 and HIV, they have 4 major things in common on the molecular bio level. And one of those is the gross manipulation of the human microbiome. The microbiome gets just disrupted. That's why, again, folks, the FLCCC, the free website, they talk about quercetin supplementation, because quercetin is a zinc ionophore, and that helps to facilitate management of the infection. But there's a problem with quercetin. If you take supplemental quercetin, it will disrupt your microbiome. The better thing to do, according to people I've talked to, just eat apples and onions and other sources of quercetin.
Dr. Hayes does the same thing. I asked her directly that question. So speaking of her,
yeah, Dr. Hayes, yeah, she was one of the ones that said that to me. She said just get it from another source. So every time I print out that thing for people, I cross it out and I put apples and onions. But But regarding inflammation, there's a connection to the gut. There's a connection to the quality of food that we put in our bodies. Fermented foods increase absorption of a lot of nutrients. So we were talking about omega-6 fatty acids recently. Dr. Raszek, do you think, based on what you've read, do you think that there could be a connection between inflammatory mediators, omega-6 fatty acids, and COVID? Do you think in theory there could be a connection?
So, just FYI, have not studied the omega-6 fatty acids, so
Okay.
don't know about that connection. But connection between inflammation and COVID, yeah, that's an obvious one. That's like a no-brainer to me. As a matter of fact, like think about it, when we first encountered COVID-19, the severity was linked to that cytokine storm. That's inflammation, right? That's your What is inflammation, by the way? It's really your overreaction of your immune system, right? So inflammation is good when it's fighting a pathogen, but it's not something you want to have either too much in one go or chronically, even at low levels, right? So it's a special weapon reserved to benefit you, but only when you're under attack. And that attack comes from well, it can be internal or external. Internal, of course, your cells can mutate and you can have something like, say, cancer development, right? And of course, you want inflammation because you want the immune system to take care of it. Inflammation is literally, it's a molecular language telling your body, hey, we're having a problem here. Come, bring the cavalry in here. Let's clean this sucker out of here, right? And with inflammation, there's consequences. But if you have this over and over and over time, this is not a good thing. It's taxing. It's Inflammation is a permanent payment to your health, to your body, right? And then, as I mentioned, immune system determines in my mind, the ultimate outcomes of your health. And you can think of your immune system as finite entity in your body. It's not a forever fountain of goodness. It has a pre-built-in biological clock that eventually it will end working for you. That's part of aging, and no matter what, there's a natural biological end to how long we can live, and that's linked to basically how long your immune system can work for you biologically with the genetic material that our species has. Okay, so then and every time you have a taxation on that, every time you have to pay a little price for it, you just took away from that lifeline little by little by little. And if you want to reduce inflammation, this is strictly based on my studies, right? So I'm parting with my own wisdom, and remember, anyone's wisdom is subject to being incorrect, right? It's just simply my studies. And but if I think of inflammation, number one cause I will always think is food. And if you want to reduce that, you watch your food. And if you don't know what to do, how to improve your diet, if you have really confused at this moment because you haven't studied, then reduce the amount of food you eat and you automatically will reduce the inflammation as well. So it's like, for me, food is very, very obvious. And then we talked about microbiome, food, microbiome, absolutely. Microbiome is so fascinating, so complicated. One day, I don't know whether this will be in my lifetime or not, I do believe we will have drugs that will actually be a special combinations of microbiome simply to influence that of our own once we understand the complexity. But the complexity right now is very, very vast. We still have to learn a lot, but you have to understand how powerful your microbiome is, because it makes up more of you as we're sitting here in front of each other than your own human cells, right? Way, way, way more content, including the weight by mass. is are the bacteria and viruses and fungi than the actual human cells. So of course they're insanely influential on what's happening with you, and in such ways that people would never even consider. How you think, how you behave might very well be linked to your microbiome. Don't know how elaborate these links are between your, say, personality and your microbiome, but I would not be surprised if eventually we could see that there is literally a bacteria composition in different tissues that are linked to how you act. That's how powerful it is. And I'm giving you this as an example to just open your mind how powerful it is. Because if you can think that bacteria in your gut could be influencing how you think, then imagine how powerful it would be just on your immune system. And it is. They're linked, completely linked together. The microbiome also is part of your immune system defenses as well.
That's awesome. And antibiotic use. I remember one of the most crushing things I learned about, let's just say clindamycin, a really old drug, really effective for a lot of infections. You take 2 days of clindamycin, it takes you 2 years to recover your microbiome and to get even close to the diversity back in your gut that you once had. So antibiotic use.
To me, they're like miniature nukes.
Yeah.
When you take an antibiotic, that's a nuclear option, meaning,
Yeah.
in my mind, the way I study this, it's an option for a medical doctor of last resort, or how it should be. And the reason why is because you're dropping a nuclear bomb on the microbiome. And you mentioned recovery. Some species will never come back because there might not be any left to seed the future population, and you might never be able to have it re-enter your body. Some of them might have came to your possession strictly because of birth, right? And what you were doused with during the process of birth, right? So they're very specialized tissue bacteria, right, that you might never ever see again. Antibiotics should always be considered with caution, in my opinion, but that's a current knowledge. The decades preceded that, where that was not even a thought, because we didn't have the technology to understand. Right now we can so easily start looking at microbiome composition, so we understand how powerful and, as a consequence, also dangerous antibiotics can be.
And the importance of our appendix. Hopefully surgeons out there who might be listening, I don't know if there's any surgeons who watch my show. Your appendix actually has a function. So a lot of people, they might be having one abdominal surgery, and the surgeon just says, hey, well, BT dubs, let's just take out the appendix while we're in there, just to save them another surgery, right? Well, there's an old study that came out of the UK, and there's an increased risk of Clostridioides difficile infection in people who've had their appendix removed. And it turns out your appendix has lymphoid tissue, and the argument is that it's like a last resort reservoir of microbiome that your gut keeps to regulate the microbiome. So that's just another indicator that we're born with the organs we have. We should try to maintain them as best we can. Now, I want to back up, go to the omega-6 topic. Omega-3s, most people have heard of omega-3s and that they're good for you. And then some people have heard of omega-6. Most people don't know what omega-9s are. And this is going to be the topic of the next podcast that we do, like later in the week, that Dan and I are going to do together. But I was just going to share with you, during the pandemic, there was a lot of chatter on mainstream media that people without any apparent medical problems were dying from the virus, right? Everybody remembers hearing that, right? Mm-hmm. So look at the typical Western diet, and what is the omega-6 content of that? You have canola oil, which is really rapeseed oil, which was originally a type of engine oil not meant for humans to consume, right? All these other cooking oils, all these other sources of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fat, really high omega-6 content. And in one of our last podcasts, I found a study on human alveolar cells, and they looked at omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So people with the high ratio of omega-6 to 3, so like about an 8 to 1 or 6 to 1, those alveolar cells had much higher and exaggerated cytokine release with an infectious insult. Compare that to the group that was omega-3 to 6 ratio of 1 to 1 or 1 to 2, so almost a 1 to 1 ratio, you could say. Those cells didn't have that response. So this is the big problem. Where do you get a sustainable source of omega-3s? If this is true, we have a bunch of problems. We don't have enough sources of omega-3s. A lot of omega-3s can go bad real quick. We just did a thing on olive oil and how hard it is to actually get real olive oil. And I think the influence of omega-6 and also just the horrible Western diet on the pandemic is being largely ignored.
Yeah, although, you know why it's, I think, largely ignored is because in a way it's obvious. We all know that it's that we have an awful diet, and we kind of learn to accept it and live with it, and consequences be damned, and then it's and we just go for it, and we just assume, hey, if the problems that will arrive, they'll arrive later in my life, and then I'll deal with it then, right? It's it's very, to me, it's very obvious that poor diet, and remember I was mentioning diet to me equals inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
Inflammation equals degradation over time of your immune system quality, and if your immune system is not on the ideal level, you will pay the price upon infection, right? And sometimes it might be, you might be okay, but sometimes it might be really bad, right? And to me, that is an obvious link. But the question is, why are we cleaning up our diet? Why are we still promoting the concept of diet that is ultimately so unhealthy for you? If you really, really want to do something for your health, my number one thought would be diet. Well, maybe before that, stop smoking. That's probably, it would be if you're a smoker. But the nice thing about North American culture is that smoking actually is indeed in decline, right? So which I is wonderful in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
from the benefits that are brought to your body. But then next subsequent one would be diet. Then after one, I'd be like exercise, outdoors, especially outside, right? You do these things regularly, and exercise has to be something fun, because I think where we lack is having the ability to discipline ourselves as human beings, and I think that's very common. I easily fall into that group, and look, I'm very brainwashed in my head about food and diet and so on. I try to live a healthy life, and man, do I break my own rules all the time,
Of
right?
course.
All the time, right? But diet is the one that we should be pushing more and more. I think there is a certain wake up call in North America to that. This is why we have such a strong organic movement and so on. But in reality, it comes down to less fried food, more home cooked meals, right?
Mm-hmm.
From the basics, really basics, including you make your own sauces. It's the combination of all these different chemicals that end up in your food that in the end up in you, and that adage, you are what you eat, is so true. Fuel only goes through, well, I don't want to say only one way, through your mouth. Like we absorb information with our entire body, including we can absorb chemicals and so on through our skin, but obviously that's not going to be your major content of absorption. It's mostly what you put into your mouth that will end up as a chemical source of what happens in your body, right? So yeah, food is number one. We need a big culture change when it comes to respecting diet because of how influential it is to our body, and therefore respecting our bodies. But we're not in that world. We're not in that mentality, I don't think.
Well, no, it's more important to push medications to manage type 2 diabetes than it is to cut out the foundation of type 2 diabetes, which is Western food, which is eating all the time, carbs all the time, and not knowing how to
But
do
it,
intermittent fasting.
in my opinion, that's not your role as a doctor. I mean, yeah, of course, you want your patients to be as healthy as possible and see them as frequently with these problems or as infrequently with these problems as possible. You don't want to be seeing them, but ultimately, look, we're not discovering any crazy notions here, right? Everyone
Yeah.
knows this already. Everyone knows diet, exercise, don't smoke, have good sleep. Those are the pillars of high quality health. We
I
all
do.
know this. It really just comes down to, but what do we personally do about it? And it comes down to our habits. So the question is, how do we alter these habits so that maybe we can achieve what you're wishing we could be achieving, which is healthier population that eats more healthy. But that's not gonna be you as a doctor, really, because you as a doctor, usually you're we go to doctors when we have a problem. We don't go to a doctor for preventative purposes. And if you want to go see a doctor for preventative purposes, what would a doctor tell you? Eat well, exercise, don't smoke, sleep well, stuff we already all know.
But the question is the doctor practicing what they preach? There's that well-known doctor now somewhere on the East Coast who was pushing all these mainstream things, and they ate fast food all the time. So I think I'm going to respectfully disagree with you. I do think it is my job because nobody else is doing it. Number one, and more to that, like the USDA says pizza's a vegetable. Okay, USDA puts Lucky
That's
Charms
nonsense.
on the health chart. They're saying Lucky Charm, and that's just an example. Nothing against the company. I mean, they taste great, but if that's all you're eating, you're going to get in trouble, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but
that's
but
nonsense.
but
Yeah.
but, but like, if I just tell a patient that you got to have a healthy lifestyle, they're going to go to some nutritionist who that the ADA probably funded their training, and the nutritionist might tell them to use artificial sweeteners, which are completely not found in nature, and aspartame in particular kills neurons and causes brain tumors and makes diabetes worse. So, instead of doctors, like, if doctors are just supposed to be a representative of the entire healthcare industry, then pharmacists could just do our job, because physical exams don't happen as much anymore. Patients tell me this all the time. So this is not based on a
Mm.
study. I've lost count of all the patients that come to me and say, "Oh, my other doctor of 15 years, 20 years, they examined me one time and then they never laid a stethoscope on me again." So, you know, um, I think doctors are perceived as drug monkeys. Honestly, I think people think that that's what we do. We just dole out meds. In which case, you could just go to a pharmacist. So I think it's our job to protect patients from side effects of medications. I think it's our job to facilitate understanding of all of their decisions, and I think that it's also our job to motivate the patients, and not just rely on a psychiatrist or a psychologist to do that. Most psychiatrists don't do psychotherapy anymore. Psychologists are hard to find, and so then where does that education and that motivation come from if it's not going to come from a primary doctor who's passionate about it? I mean, you're right. I mean, how many other people are passionate about it and take the time? I don't know.
I mean, well said. And of course, I agree with you with the concept. It's just that mm, it will take more than just you medical doctors telling patients, oh yeah, by the way, consider that,
Yeah.
because we do already all know that. That's my whole point. So that we need bigger forces to enact that change, and those forces come from cultural habits, and that's where the challenge comes in, because that has to do with parenting styles and how children are raised. Like I don't blame people for their laziness and ignorance, because a lot of the times most of that programming happens in your childhood. What we really need to do is change probably how we raise our kids, and that includes yeah, and that includes the diet as well, and because it has a multi-generational impact. Hence, hence, there is certain push in Europe. My ethnic background, I'm European, not to allow fast food infiltrate their cultural diets that were developed over centuries.
Yes.
And the reason why is because we can see the aftermath of that. We already know that because those experiments have been executed over last, say, 5 or 6 decades in both Canada and the United States. And we already know what the consequences are. And yes, some European countries are overrun with fast food more than others, but we know these. So it's cultural. We have removed the pleasure, for example, of what sharing a meal is all about, where we can then maybe experience high quality food because it also comes with pleasant company and so on, right? It we
Mhm.
need we need bigger efforts than that. To me, the government is potentially failing if a pizza is considered a vegetable. If French fries is considered a vegetable, yeah, someone somewhere probably made inappropriate decisions, right?
Yeah.
We have a lot of scientific information that can inform on to a better degree of what is really healthy, and we could probably now start making these food pyramids more people specific to specific types of people with specific conditions and so on, and make it much more easy accessible. Maybe we should be considering subsidizing healthy foods as opposed to, I don't know, where we're wasting money on subsidizing things, something that is not maybe more nonsensical, like where it's not really serving the same benefits to the society. Mm, Maybe I don't know, because I don't get to think of it on that level, but our problem in general is a cultural problem, because we love fast food, and so do I just avoid it because I'm brainwashed with my own studies, right? I,
Well,
I understand that if I'm gonna eat fast food, it means inflammation. Okay, right? It is awesome, but it's the training that we need on a deeper cultural level, that you can only have this in a small proportion. Larger proportion should be homemade meals.
So you both have mentioned diet frequently and often. So I think it's pretty simple, but many people probably are unaware. So limit sugar, limit processed foods, eat uh, unprocessed fruits and vegetables, and meat, right? That would be your general recommendation, both of you?
For sure, my number one is sugar. Number one, limit sugar. By far, it's something that I've been mm, training myself as an adult, pretty much my entire adult life, is how to continuously minimize sugar in general. And when I'm talking about sugar, is the sugar you add in as an additive. And because of course everything you eat has sugars.
Mhm.
Everything is sugar. Around us is covered in sugar. If I always joke that if you had the ability to put like special glasses on that allow you to see sugar, you would see everything around you glisten, because
yeah.
every single living organism, every single bacteria is covered in sugar molecules. So
Sure.
sugar is an umbrella term for many different types of chemicals, right? So when you get your sugars from fruits, go at it. I have my own certain rules. So for example, one of my rules is no limit to fruits. No limit. I can eat as many fruits as I want. Why I have that rule is because I never eat enough fruits anyway, you know? So I don't care if I overdose on sugar with bananas and suddenly like, boom, I'm spiking my sugar level, because those are all natural compounds that your microbiome knows how to deal with, and so on. And as I mentioned, I'm already not eating enough fruits. Those sugars will come with other nutritional support and so on, right?
Hmm.
I really, really remove sugar as much as possible. Biggest one, I would say, the number one thing, if you want to improve your diet, remove sugar. It would be, it's just my
Reduce
standard.
inflammation as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right. I also reduced meat intake dramatically. So I always say I'm about 90% vegetarian, maybe 80% vegetarian, and then 10 to 20% I will have food with meat. Um, and and again, nothing against meat. I love meat. It's delicious. Hence, I consume it. I tried being vegetarian. Meat also has its own benefits as well, because it can concentrate certain chemicals that are good for your body as well. But meat also has a price tag, biological price tag too, right? Hence, and everything should be in balance and moderation. So that's another one that I consider. And then where if you're reducing meat, it automatically means more vegetables in your diet, because you need to, have something on your plate,
Sure.
right? So more vegetables, and a variety of vegetables, and ideally cook it at home, keep it simple, make the
Not
sauces
processed.
yourself,
Yeah.
which is
I
actually a lot simpler than what people think. Once you start getting into the habit, um, you can make good flavors, but that's the tricky part. Sometimes, how do you make good flavors, right? If you're cooking on your own, as opposed to like if you go out to a restaurant and they're giving you something nice and fried, yeah, it's always delicious, right? We love sugar and we love fat, because those are the two things that are just makes our brain go, "Boo, yeah,
Very
that's
tasty
delicious."
too.
Yeah, the fat topic is a good topic because there's and again we talked about this briefly in the last podcast is recommendations coming out of respected institutions that are just, which I have a problem with. I'm just going to say I think they're wrong. Um, Specifically that butter's bad for you and margarine is better for you, and canola oil is good and all these seed oils are good, but I do agree that maybe we don't need to eat meat as much as some people like to eat it. I also think that not everybody should have the same diet. I think there's epigenetic influences. I think there's a big difference between people, say, who are of Native American descent or just the Latino descent, in my side of the world here down in Yuma, um, because you were talking about generations, Dr. Raszek. So, for example, nopales. For people who don't know what nopales are, it's a green cactus that does not have all those sharp, big spines on it. It has tiny spines, but it's an edible cactus. And the short of it is, you eat that cactus, drops your blood sugar. Period. It just drops it. So you go to places in the desert where you find these cactuses in the middle of nowhere, and you do some digging, you'll often find Native American ruins there because these people have a genetic connection to this plant. So they're built for prolonged periods of fasting. They'll eat meat every maybe few months when they catch something. Hunter gatherer diet. Uh, and they eat the nopales, and so then I think epigenetically they adapted to that. So those people are only a few hundred years away from their epigenetic indigenous diet. So then you have all these people from Europe, and they've had grains for 6,000 years plus, and then you have Native Americans, and so you see this disparity of type 2 diabetes prevalence. But everybody gets taken by it in the end if they're not eating healthy. So you're always going to see that mild smoldering A1C of 5.9 or 6.2 in the Caucasian, 70-year-old person who's eating kind of whatever they want. you're just going to see more of that illness early on in the life of people who I'm saying have that epigenetic link to nopales, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Would think that there would be massive correlations between your ethnic genetic background. By ethnic, I meant you as a population being locked in a specific geographical location,
Exactly.
and and uh, and um, and that local diet, because indeed there would have been an influence, symbiotic usually influence going on, right? Yeah, the same thing how you're talking about diet, and the same thing how one geographical location can support living with certain pathogens because of adaptation, versus you bring those pathogens to a new location and you bring trouble. Now, of course, that's kind of like we become globalized, so that's no longer the case. But clearly, we all know in history what happened when one group of people went to discover new continents and brought new pathogens with them, and pathogens could decimate populations that were completely naive to these pathogens, right? So because of lack of adaptation, there was no time to allow to adapt. And the same thing goes for diet. Absolutely. Yeah, of course, I would totally agree that if you can, it would be wonderful if we could start connecting our genetics to food. Unfortunately, that's not really scientifically worked out. There is nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics, but it just doesn't get the funding necessary to for us to fully appreciate and truly know, accurately know, how do your genetics influence your ability to process food, and therefore how should you be eating in relation to genetics. Unlike pharmacogenetics or pharmacogenomics, which is same enzymes, but now we're looking at medications instead, and that has been worked out for a lot of medications now, and we can make these correlations. But that those correlations for a clinical use, they cost millions and millions of dollars. So we
Yeah.
don't have the same investment opportunities to learn how genetics could be influencing your diet, but that would be wonderful. I actually think that you can do something much more simpler, and you can measure your glucose levels. Uh, I think that one of the coolest things would be if you could measure glucose levels externally. Excuse me for the background noise there. And it'd say, without doing any
Yeah.
praise.
Yeah,
Something
they
that
have
like
the Freestyle Libre, for example, and I'm not doing a plug for them. It's just one name, but it's a continuous monitor, right? It's got like the 20 needles on it. And you stick it in your arm, right?
I would be thinking, imagine something even simpler, something like it's part of your watch. If they could do it through skin.
Cool.
Now I believe that someone was working on such technology, hence the concept is in my head. Now I don't know how viable that technology is, but let's pretend it is, that this totally could work. Then imagine if your phone could just tell you, and did it with monitoring how your glucose responds, blood glucose level respond based on food. That would be a wonderful way of actually looking at how to maybe manipulate your diet. But that's very sophisticated.
I
First,
but
get rid
I
of
think
fried foods,
I mean I think you
and
just
processed foods.
you remember the SGLT transporters? There's like 10 of them now or something. The sodium glucose co transporter in the gut.
Okay.
Do you remember?
Uh,
I think a perfect idea would be to study that transporter indirectly by giving one group of people a continuous glucose monitor, giving them unsalted rice, and then giving the other group excessively or variably salted rice, and then track all their glucose numbers. Because I think we also oversalt a lot of things in the United States. And yet I have friends that go to the Philippines, they go to these countries out in Polynesia, and these people are eating rice like by the tub, and they look like twigs, but they don't salt their rice. And they prepare it, I think, in a very specific way. Actually, a naturopath friend of mine, well, no, a functional medicine friend of mine told me a very specific way to prepare rice. and he specifically recommended coconut oil and no salt. And his argument was that when you sear the rice in the coconut oil without water, and then you add the water after a period of time, what happens is the rice becomes more resistant to absorptive digestion, and it becomes more of a promoter for a microbiome lattice structure. And so, so you get more of a beneficial microbiome nutrient mass and less of a glucose spike from it.
Hmm.
But
So run this by me again. So you take the rice, you don't wash it first.
Well, I mean, maybe you wash it. I can't
with
remember.
all coconut oil.
Yeah, like I think he said a half a cup of rice or a cup of rice or something, and then like a teaspoon of coconut oil, and then you just gently warm it up in there, and you get it mixed up so that all the rice kind of looks shiny, and then you add your water. But there might have been more details other than that. So I would love
I'm
to
gonna try that just how you say it anyway.
yeah, I mean, so something like that, and then you do that, and then you prepare rice like the old-fashioned sticky way. You know, you throw the water, you throw the salt in there, you heat it up, you get it all like fluffed up and mushy, and you eat it and compare the glucose spikes. I mean, I guarantee the one that you prepare the old way, so it's all sticky. It just seems like that's going to smolder in the small bowel and just spike the sugar. This is why I tell my patients that want to fast. Everybody thinks that, oh, nothing after midnight. Hogwash, total hogwash. That's a scam. I think it's a scam to see pre-diabetes and diabetes the next morning to get people on drugs. Because when I tell people no dinner, don't eat dinner the day before. Now they're fasting 16, even like 24 hours in advance, almost all the time, unless they have some weird gut problem. I always see a lower glucose. Like if you eat half a pizza at 6 o'clock, okay, your blood sugar is not going to be normal at 8 o'clock. Sorry. It's not.
So I'll give you a very interesting theory I heard as to why you want to no longer eat, say, till post afternoon, so that the peak of your fast can coincide with the middle of your sleep. And
Yes.
the reason, so hence no more food till past midnight, no more food, actually more like past 5 p.m. at the latest. Because then what happens is the fasting peak is in the middle of your sleep, and apparently in the middle of your sleep, that's also when the brain regeneration mechanisms kick in. And if you can combine it with fasting, which are supposed to stimulate the removal of gunk that accumulates in your cells as a byproduct of well, cells living, and it produces garbage. That garbage eventually gets cleaned up by fasting. The fasting process is supposed to trigger that mechanism, autophagy, and that autophagy is triggered especially after certain period of time of fasting. If you can coincide it with the sleep where your brain activity is stimulated for regenerating the brain, then you also supposedly the autophagy gets to be stimulated at the same time, cleans up the neuronal cells in your brain, and therefore you enhance the protection of your brain's function. That's at least a suggested theory that I heard, which I was like, that's very interesting, fascinating.
Wow. That explains why you just explained why the patients that do what I tell them to do feel better and they're eating less.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of fasting myself. I fast as well, and right now I'm experimenting with just having now one meal in a day. It's not easy. Sometimes I get my cravings, and then when do cravings happen? Around midnight. I'm like, oh, go to sleep now, you know.
Well, yeah, that means you stayed up too late.
Yeah. I'm a night owl. I like the calmness of night and studying. So I can sometimes study late.
Yeah.
But
Gosh.
I agree, like that's yeah, much smarter is to follow circadian rhythm, you know.
And that's
That's
also based on your geolocation. So that's based on like where you are on the planet. So, you know, people will need different amounts of sleep based on the season and how far away they are from the equator. So, I mean, we are unfortunately connected to the planet we live on. So we should try to follow the rules of nature, as I like to say. So I guess one other thing, do you have more time, or do you have to go, Dr.
No,
Western?
go for it. Go for it.
Okay.
I booked the time off that you told me to book off. So it's already.
Okay. Well, I'm hoping we don't run too long, because this is already kind of a long podcast, and I'm trying to cut them shorter. But like I feel like I could talk to you for just several more hours. But I didn't want to miss this topic that I wrote down. Can you explain the IgG class switch to IgG4 in COVID vaccine recipients? And could you kind of unpack that for us? And I'm not asking for a book review on Dr. Bosch's book, which I do want to get and read, but could you just explain that, and what the concerns are? Because I'm trying to make sense of it. And again, I'm just the clinical guy putting my hands on the patient to take care of them. So you're the guy who really interprets. So I was hoping to hear your spiel on that.
So first of all, with regards to Dr. Bosch's book, they're linked, but he doesn't really talk about much in his book in terms of IgG4s. Later on, the way I understand, he connected, the name I was using, that actually would be IgG4s. I don't even recommend reading his book because it's so insanely complicated that unless you are immunology expert, it probably is just going to be too much. I tried reading it, and I've been now really hyper focused on studying immunology last few years, and my doctorate degree is linked to immunology. So like I don't come with zero background, and it was too insane. But then let's talk about IgG4s. What's happening? It's one of those very surprising, unusual side effects, long-term side effects from mRNA vaccines. So you only observe it in mRNA vaccinated individuals. And we would not have been able to see this before because we're seeing this 3 years down the road, right? 3 years down the road, we're seeing this right now. And it's only being captured. And even if we had long-term studies, it might not have been captured because these IgG4s are normally not measured because it's one of the rarest antibodies we're supposed to have in our body. So what is this? It's basically an antibody, type of antibody that your body produces in order to hide something, cloak it from, so it's invisible to you in your immune system in a way. Maybe like I'm using it as an analogy. So and the way it does that is because the IgG4 antibodies, we all know how antibodies look like. It's like a letter Y, right? And the tips of your Y is what captures the pathogen fragment, that fragment that your antibodies recognize, that's called an antigen. So the tips of Y will recognize an antigen, but you have that stock at the bottom, right? Like your letter Y. It's that stock of the antibody that's different. Your normal antibodies, normally when they target the pathogen, they code it. Well, what happens after that? Like that's just one thing. Yes, antibodies will prevent them from that virus from interacting with the receptors on the cells, but what happens with it? It's those stalks that are sticking out, and they are now recognized by immune cells to destroy the entire thing. You destroy both the virus and the antibodies that coded it. Just like you take it up and boom, it's gone. You dealt with it. Now IgG4s, they have different stock, and these stocks are no longer recognized by the immune system. So you coded it, and your immune system no longer really recognizes it, so leaves it alone. This is why you have IgG4 antibodies. Normally, we can think of them as protective when you have allergen issues. So a very good example of is a beekeeper will produce IgG4 antibodies so that they no longer have to react to the I'm gonna say bee venom, whatever is being injected by the bee, right? So then this way they don't have to have this inflammatory immune response for something that is part of their normal environment. And what we're seeing now is that, and this is only observed in mRNA vaccinated individuals, we have 6 studies from all over the world confirming this now. And it's all over the world. And it's in all mRNA vaccinated individuals that are being looked at. And it depends on the circumstance, but they are producing IgG4 antibodies. Why is that a concern? That's where the debate in a scientific community is, I would say, ongoing right now, because one question, oh, is it protective? First of all, it still will mask the pathogen, the virus that you're infected with, right? But you no longer clear it out with those immune cells, but you still mask it so it cannot be infecting you. So maybe that's all good and protective, right? But the only other information we really know in any appreciable quantity about these antibodies, IgG4 antibodies, come from certain diseases. They're either autoimmune diseases or cancer. So when you see rise of these antibodies is under these circumstances as well. So then you have to be open-minded to the possibility, well, these IgG4s rise that we see in mRNA vaccinated individuals, they could also be a problem because perhaps they could be linked to the future rise of cancers as well as autoimmune conditions. So it's not something we should be dismissing. I think we should be now really keen and focusing on this because solutions might be very easy. Now, having said that, there are certain situations that if you're mRNA vaccinated individual where you will not observe this. So what are they? Well, obviously, if you're non-vaccinated, you know that's not an issue. They don't seem to be producing these IgG4s at all. That's like non-issue. So we know that it's only in mRNA vaccinated individuals because individuals who are vaccinated with virus vector-based vaccines, such as AstraZeneca, they don't produce this effect at all. They can see some of that if they had a mixture. So they did one vaccine and then they follow with mRNA, then you see a bit of a rise, but it's not the same rise as if you just took the mRNA vaccines. So that's one. If you were vaccinated with non-mRNA vaccines, you're okay. Here's a crazy one. If you got infected first and then you had your mRNA shots, and that's either Pfizer or Moderna, we see supposedly it's with both. There was only one paper that looked at both of them. Actually, no, two, believe. Both Moderna and Pfizer do it. If you were infected first and then you had your injections, you're okay. You're protected. There's no IgG rise. So that's another one. And a third one, it just a preprint came out. So that's now the sixth paper that came out. The other ones are peer reviewed. And that preprint showed that those patients who were taking certain immunosuppressive drugs, they also do not produce those IgG4s. So at least you have a certain criteria how you can eliminate yourself. But if you took vaccines, mRNA vaccines, and you took 2 shots, then if you subsequently got infected, that infection acts like a booster and it increases your IgG4s. If you took more than 2 shots and you took third shot and so on, actual boosters, then you also increase the likelihood of those IgG4s. So some mRNA vaccinated individuals should now potentially consider looking at their IgG4 levels to see if they have something that might, in terms of IgG4s, be mimicking what we're seeing in certain autoimmune diseases. They're called under like an umbrella term called IgG4 related diseases. It's just like an autism is an umbrella term to encompass many conditions, right? Then same with this.
So they could cause an MGUS, right? A monogammopathy of undetermined significance. They could cause hyperviscosity syndromes.
Possibly, because I'm not sure, depending on the number one concern is with the autoimmune diseases, it will depend on what else these IgG4 antibodies could be targeting. What else could they recognize? So that's one thing. And we really don't know that. But the biggest concern right now is cancers, because IgG4, when you affect your ratios between IgG1, which is one subtype of IgG4 subclass of antibodies, and fourth, if you increase number 4 and you decrease number 1, well, number 1 is the one that really will recognize your cancer cells, and through those stalks, immune system comes in and kills those cells, like just takes them out. if now you have IgG4, they can start competing for that function, proper function of IgG1s, and you just decrease the likelihood of immune system to recognize cancer. And if you do it enough, eventually some of the cancer will dodge the ability to be recognized, and it will have now an increased chance of continue to develop and progress. And so that's one of the questions I posed to the group that I'm part of, experts who are investigating this, from whom I'm learning a lot. And that's one of the questions I pose. Well, and sometimes in cancers, you have overexpression of a specific protein. Could that be, for example, cancer's way of fooling our immune system to start producing IgG4? Because now you have this overpresentation of antigen. And when you have too much of an antigen, too much of it, just like I say in that bee venom, why did the beekeeper start producing IgG4s? Because that bee venom kept showing up, and eventually the body was like, you know what? This got to be the part of our system. Let's leave that alone. Same thing is believed might have happened with the mRNA injections. Spike protein was overpresented to the immune system, and so now my thoughts are like, well, when cancer produces too much of a specific protein, overpresented to the immune system, could it be tricking our immune system to start producing more, just a bit more IgG4s, and those IgG4s now are interfering with the recognition of cancer, and then boom, cancer can thrive. So IgG4s, in my opinion, that we're observing in mRNA vaccinated individuals, not to be taken lightly, not to panic either, because there are people who have diseases where there is too much IgG4. There are treatments available, and some of them look like they work amazingly well. So that means, but we should be investigating this, because we might have accidentally induced certain way of perturbing the immune system. And the reason why it says accidentally, because the typical dogma in vaccinology is more is better. More antigen is better. And when the quantity of antigen presentation via mRNA technology was being tested, it was tested on a short term, and it was tested to see what's the amount of vaccine that we can put in an individual that will guarantee robust, immediate response. And that was the focus. We want immediate, fast response, because we want the immune system to be triggered right away, as fast as possible. Boom, our immune system is now trained to recognize spike protein. That was the focus. What was not perhaps understood is that maybe there is such a concept as too much could be a problem. And that's possibly where we are at now. But the way I think, if you are mRNA vaccinated individuals and you were not pre-infected first, and especially if you took a booster or you had an infection after an original series of 2 shots, consider looking at your IgG4 antibody levels to see if they're in a normal range, which I would expect to be in the majority, or whether they're outside of normal range. And if they're outside of normal range, talk to immunology specialist.
Wow.
Yeah, a little different message, because that one is coming out of it's still flying under the radar, because no one expected to see this. No one. Not even vaccine makers.
And IgGs can be checked in most basic medical labs. So,
but that's different. IgG as a total will be checked. You need to start looking at the subtypes.
The subtypes. Yeah, I remember.
Okay, yeah.
Usually, big hospital systems have the subtypes. Small labs, I don't think they can check the subtypes. So, clinicians, if you're going to check this, make sure you check with the lab. Make sure that they can actually check the subtypes. This is great. I mean, this is wonderful to know, and we should keep watch.
I'm really hyper focused right now on this topic of IgG4s. That's where I put most of my effort and energy right now, because my first immediate thought is, what do we do to protect people in case this is a problem? Because the reason why is because we literally all over the world vaccinated billions of people with this technology.
Well, humanity was the phase 1 trial, right? This wasn't even really tested. Actually, it was it was phase 1 that when they rolled it out for the EUA.
It was past phase 3 clinical trials. So there was 2 clinical trials. There was phase 1, very short-lived. It was just to determine the actual ideal dosage. And then there was phase 2, 3 clinical trial combined that involved about 44,000 individuals. That's when the very famous quote 95% effective came out of. What very few people understand, though, is that within those 44,000 people, that was split into 22,000 placebo, 22,000 who took the vaccine, and there was similar numbers for both mRNA and Moderna and Pfizer. But very few people know that the 95% effective comes from comparing how many people were infected in one group with COVID-19 versus the other. And there was almost no infections in that clinical trial. So the total number of people who were infected in that Pfizer clinical trial, this is from memory, so forgive me, I could always screw it up a little bit, the number, but I believe that it was about 8 people were infected in a vaccine arm and about 160, maybe 2 people in the placebo arm. So it's the rollout of the emergency use application of this vaccine, which is what it was approved for by the FDA, was based on the fact that not even 200 people were infected and 95% effectiveness against COVID-19 was based on not even 200 individuals that were impacted in that clinical trial.
And it
Very,
was only
very low number, such a low number that that I would have preferred to see more clinical trials, but there was honestly there was a overwhelming desire by the world, by the entire world, to have vaccine as fast as possible. That's undeniable. We're clamoring for it, and we're like, when do we have vaccine? When do we have vaccine? What can we do to get the vaccine as fast as possible? And the and the projections, when they're coming out, oh well, if we can do vaccine very fast. It takes many years. Well, we have this new technology. Maybe this will speed it up a bit, and it did. That vaccine was developed in less than 9 months since the moment that the public health emergency declaration came out that we have dealing with the pandemic to when it was approved. It was approved within a matter of months. In a way, an incredible achievement. But if you're making it that fast, you also have to reduce your pool of knowledge overall as to what the technology could be doing. And it's a brand new technology. So yes, there were clinical trials, but overall, all of us right now are part of a trial, right? And it's by far the greatest experiment humanity has ever undertaken, because we've inoculated so many people with something that is in the end experimental, with very little studies beforehand, because of the fact that we felt we're under such an emergency that we needed this rapid rollout.
So
But that's now, but we have to be now open-minded that witnessing long-term effects, which we did not have the privilege to study for, should not be a surprise if they might emerge. And this is one of really big ones. Hence, it also, because as a scientist, and when I read science papers, I can tell you there is a narrative that is preferred in science, and there's also a narrative that is not so welcome. And you can tell by what kind of publications come out and which journals publish which narrative, right? So typically, narrative that is in any way negative against the COVID-19 vaccines in general is not very welcome. This one is so surprising that it came out and it got peer reviewed because no one understood what it means. at the moment, it's not recognized whether these IgG4s are in any way bad to the individuals who now have them post mRNA shots. I'm just saying we should be vigilant because we do have information in science where it suggests that IgG4 antibodies can indeed lead to problems. And cancers is the one that I would be concerned about the most right now. And you do hear a lot of rumors that I was never able to substantiate through scientific publications, but you hear a lot of rumors that cancers are on the rise from medical community, that cancers are on the rise and they're also atypical in what would have been normally observed in the past. But again, rumors. I want to believe it when I see substantiation in some published form. So that's just how I choose to regulate how I accept my knowledge.
Well, I hope we study it.
Well, I hope so too. I hope so too. But I'm trying to amplify that message. It is a topic of interest for sure, and the reason why is because my average viewership of videos is nothing great, and then IgG4s pop up and it spikes a lot. I think people are concerned. And one thing I learned during pandemic is that population wisdom is nothing that we should dismiss as a community of professionals. People are actually can be very, very wise, and it's worthwhile listening to that wisdom of the layman population because they research information as well. We're all very intelligent, and now we all can research information very easily with our fingertips, right? Type it in a computer, and you can start diving in and learning. And this wisdom is nothing to be dismissed. I actually think we should be studying population wisdom, and when they suggest what should be done, to what degree, for example, that wisdom correlates with outcomes. I think that that would be something very, very valuable because, again, population will research information differently than doctors.
So I'm curious, are there any other long-term risk factors associated or potentially associated with mRNA vaccines? So cancer being one, potentially.
One potential non-specific effects, and all vaccines have non-specific effects, and they can be both beneficial and harmful. One of them we're learning, if you start looking at the literature, that certain types of vaccines can have beneficial non-specific effect in that they prevent other infections, respiratory infections, versus another type of vaccines might increase the likelihood of respiratory infections. This might potentially be the case with mRNA vaccines, and the reason why is because they are not based on technology that we used in the past, which was to use an entire pathogen that was no longer had the capacity to reproduce, but you were actually inoculated with what was real pathogen. We have since moved to other technologies that focus more not about presenting entire pathogen to you, but presenting a fragment of the pathogen. That's what the mRNA does as well, because mRNA obviously is the blueprint that tells your cell to produce the spike protein, and a spike protein is just a fragment of the pathogen. There is now accumulating body of evidence that could suggest that if you're using those non-live vaccines or vaccines that don't use the entire pathogen, they increase the likelihood of respiratory infections in general. So much so that I've been invited not long ago to participate in this review with these co-authors on this very topic. And the suggestion is it's very easy to fix that problem. You simply follow your non-live vaccine with a live vaccine and it takes care of that completely. So we're not saying change or stop using these vaccines. We're saying reconsider the order of vaccination so that if you're doing series of vaccinations, finish with the live one, because when you present the entire pathogen vaccine, they're so powerful in triggering other elements of your immune system that they protect you from other respiratory infections in general as well. So you're asking me a hypothetical question. I'm hypothetically answered that one possible theory I could be open-minded to as a possibility could be that perhaps the mRNA vaccines also increase the likelihood of respiratory infections afterwards. There might be some evidence to support that. Might be, correlation is not a causation, because there have been some publications showing that the more mRNA injections you have, the greater your likelihood of actually being infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus and get COVID-19. So that information has at least been trickling out as well. So, but is it set in stone? The answer is no. The answer is no. It's just I would be open to the possibility of that.
Right. Thank you.
Right. Well, Dr. Raszek, thank you so much for coming on here with us on a Saturday. This is awesome. I mean, you got me thinking about a lot of stuff. I'm going to be reading all your articles, as many as I can. Is it okay with you if we post the link to your site on this video after we post it?
Of course, of course. The website itself is more of an educational tool. So anyone who's thinking of doing medical DNA testing, you can go and study the process. It's laid out, and it's not a trivial read, but it's laid out, and the purpose of that website is to prepare such an individual towards informed consent of what it means to take a medical DNA test. And the other big one, of course, is YouTube channel, because my blog is where I venture wherever I want. It's my freedom of expression. So there's blog is linked to that website, but another one, separate one, is same handle name, Merogenomics, and you can find me on YouTube, and it is a popular channel by now, and so I'm very blessed to have a large following, which now gives me the pleasure, and it is a pleasure to produce these videos where I explain science that is coming out. What we talked about, it's based on the science I read, and IgG4, as I mentioned, is the topic that I'm keenly interested in right now.
So just a quick follow-up, just out of my curiosity. So medical DNA testing, you're an expert in that field. Do you think is it worthwhile to do, say, a 23andMe or Ancestry, or is that a waste of money?
So I studied 23andMe to an amazing detail. So is it worthwhile? Yes, if you understand its limitations. That's the most important message, I would say, is because if you take the 23andMe test, which now has a dual purpose, one is the ancestry, and the other one is there is health information component. What you need to understand that the health information component will look at only specific mutations. And a very good example is the BRCA genes. These genes, when they're mutated, they can be very highly implicated in probably some of the most dangerous cancers we can think of, especially breast and ovarian cancers in women. This test looks at, I believe, maybe 3 mutations off the top of my head, just a few mutations. But you have to appreciate that if you get a negative result, meaning no mutations were found, that doesn't mean you don't have a mutation in that gene. It means you don't have that specific one, only one that they looked for. So they didn't look at another 99.99% of the gene at all. So it's a gaping hole of information. So you just have to appreciate the limitation of the test. It looks it's like looking at a grain of sand of information in a Sahara desert, right? So I obviously would be far more biased towards looking at your entire genetic information.
So
That's more costly.
what I hear you saying is if somebody were to do a 23andMe, be concerned about a result, go see you or someone similar to yourself.
Yes, and it's legit. If you have a mutation and the test tells you, hey, you have this genetic predisposition towards breast and ovarian cancer, for sure, legitimate finding because the sequencing is very high quality and it will be very likely, very likely this is now a real result. So I could tell you that if a patient comes to a medical doctor with 23andMe result and it shows them, hey, I have a mutation that supposedly links me to either this condition predisposition or this disease outright, as a doctor, you do not want to ignore that. At that point, it's very real. If you
Roger
take
that.
the test and you find the mutation, it's real, then a doctor should confirm it with some form of a clinical test. But do not disregard it. But it's not a test that you should ever use for clinical investigation because of its tremendous limitation of how little information it looks at. So that when the test 23andMe test started looking at the BRCA genes, there was to some degree an outcry from the genetic counseling community, and the outcry was on the account that, listen, people will be misinformed. They will think they were tested and tested completely, whereas that's not the case. And a lot of people who might have then used maybe different tests that would have been more accurate in discovery process, they will no longer take it because they will take 23andMe while they're misinformed because they didn't study it properly as to what the limitations are.
So conversely, what you're saying is if you come back and you're negative for whatever disease, that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot.
That's right. But if you're positive, take it seriously.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that no doctor should medical doctor should disregard it. If you have a positive result on 23andMe, then you take it and you reconfirm it. You take it for real because the technology employed would have been almost certain to succeed in really discovering that mutation.
All right. I appreciate the information.
Cheers.
Wonderful.
That's my world that I love to study and yeah, so no problem. I can talk
Very
about
fascinating.
genetics for hours. But don't
Great.
worry, I'm done.
Okay. Well, Dr. Raszek, we would love to have you on again to discuss other topics. I mean, there's a bunch of things that we didn't get to today, and I think this is already a really long podcast, but we would love to have you on in the future. And any parting words for the audience?
Get outside, get outdoors, spend time being active outside in the nature, and it's extremely powerfully healing. And then we are in this very weird situation where our population immunity is not the same as what it was prior to pandemic. Push your ability to practice healthy lifestyle just a notch further if you can, and then that's a good way for everyone to attempt to protect themselves in this still uncharted territory pandemic that we're in, because pandemic is not over. People say it's over, but the virus is still kicking around, and it's now one of the most infectious viruses we have ever seen. If it evolved to be a monster, it just doesn't now end up with people in a hospital, but we still have a monster around. So protect yourself by improving your ability of healthy living just a notch, whatever you're capable of. That's my message would be for absolutely everyone.
Wonderful
message.
And thank you for having me. And of course, anytime you guys wanna do a redo, I'll be more than happy. It's a lot of fun and a pleasure chatting with you guys, and a pleasure for me to learn back from you as well. And so very much thoroughly enjoyed. hang out with you.
I learned a lot. Well, there you have it, folks. Dr. Mikolai Raszek, I think I said it right this time, from Alberta, Canada, merogenomics.ca. That's his genetics website. And then if you add a /blog, that's where you can find some of the articles we talked about today under the doctor's link. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We will see you next time.